When running thermal tests for PowerColor's Red Dragon 5600 XT with its initial VBIOS upgrade available publicly and with its reviewer VBIOS, our office smelled like a fire alarm waiting to happen. A familiar melting electronics smell was accompanied with the tests as the card burned itself at 110 degrees Celsius and throttled clocks to 1100 megahertz, all while one fan sat idly by and the other one spun at embarrassingly low RPMs. The most recent updates fixed much of this, of course, and so it's worth going through the Red Dragon for each of its VBIOS options as it compares against the Sapphire Pulse. We'll be focusing entirely on thermals and noise for this, as the two cards are similar overall in gaming performance since the base GPU and the GDDR6 dictate this level of performance. But the thermals are where the Red Dragon gets interesting. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Corsair Virtuoso RGB wireless gaming headset. The Corsair Virtuoso headset is comfort-focused with a set of memory foam ear pads, headband, and lightweight construction. The Virtuoso wireless headphones use 50mm drivers that range from 20 Hz to 40 kHz with a wireless connection that ranges up to 60 feet. Corsair also includes a detachable, high-quality microphone for voice comms. Learn more at the link in the description below. This one's pretty easy to go through today. We have a huge focus on frequency and thermals, of course, and then we'll be looking at the two cards internally as well briefly. This will serve as your combined teardown plus card review video. We've already reviewed the Sapphire Pulse. We also posted a lengthy dissertation, I guess, on AMD's launch issues with this particular card, the 5600 XT GPU that goes with these cards. So the PowerColor Red Dragon has all the same issues that every other 5600 XT did at launch, which is that it shipped to reviewers with a different BIOS than would be made available later on, and then AMD asked reviewers to update their BIOS, and then you end up with cards on the market that have sort of an unknown or mystery VBIOS on them for early consumers. And that will persist to some degree later on as well. So anyway, this one's got a dual VBIOS switch. That's always a big plus for us with cards because it gives you a backup. It also lets you have some additional headroom to play around because you do have that safety net if you want to try and do some BIOS flashing for the cards where those BIOS flashes may actually realize real gains. And this one had a reviewer VBIOS for each switch, that's 2. It had a public VBIOS, number 1 we'll call it, for each switch, so that's 4. And then it now has a new, as of February 2nd, set of VBIOSes, so that brings us up to 6. We tested 2 sets of VBIOSes for this, so 4 total. The middle set was redacted and removed from the website in the middle of our testing, so we canceled it, but we have enough data to work with from the original VBIOS because it had the same issue where basically the fans didn't spin until the card hit 100 degrees Celsius junction, and that would be the hotspot temperature. Also, it's about 100 degrees Celsius edge for that because the fans don't spin. So you're basically the same temperature across the entire core. And when the fans did start spinning at 100, in the silent VBIOS, it was this one only, no second fan, and the performance dropped, obviously, significantly. You drop clocks because you start throttling because it's over 100 degrees Celsius. AMD's TJ Max on these cards is 110. AMD says that it is fine to run at 110, except for the fact that at 110 degrees, it starts to throttle. And we have a whole separate video on why AMD's choice of words there was extremely poor. Fine is one thing in that technically within spec, but not acceptable or fine for an aftermarket card, where the entire point of it is obviously to not run at 110 degrees Celsius. Anyway, it's been fixed with the newer VBIOSes, but we want to show both sets of tests because if you bought it already or if you applied the upgrade VBIOS that was made available originally, you'll want to reflash it with the newest one as of, again, basically the day before or 2 days before this video goes live. So there's a lot to go over here. Let's just do frequency, thermals, and we'll look at the inside of the card before we figure out if it's worth buying. Getting into the charts, the nature of the fans not spinning in the first set of tests means that we should start with frequency rather than thermals, as we'll need the data to illustrate a few points later. Starting with just the Red Dragon 5600 XT and ignoring the Sapphire Pulse for a moment, we end up with this chart. The original OC result in our 3D Mark freeze frame test has frequency just below 1600 MHz, expected for the day 1 VBIOS with a more limited power target and clocks as set by AMD. Switching to the silent VBIOS though, we see where PowerColor really went wrong here. It's as if they didn't do any testing at all. Literally, no one turned this card on with that VBIOS before they shipped it out. How this happened, we have absolutely no idea. It's a tremendous oversight by PowerColor, and this should never happen, especially never get into the hands of reviewers, and definitely not shipped to the public. One of the fans never turned on, leaving just one of the two fans spinning at very slow speeds. Further, the single fan that was spinning didn't start until the GPU junction temperature hit 100 degrees Celsius, and because it was spinning so slowly, so late, and because of TJ Maxx obviously being just 10 degrees away, we were in a runaway thermal scenario. The only thing that saved it was that the GPU was able to drop its frequency, which it did, to about 1100 megahertz. So maybe 1200. So if you're wondering how this impacts gameplay, the short of it is that there would no longer be any gameplay. There'd be a slideshow. The GPU was overheating and throttling as a result of the bad VBIOS, and worse yet, this VBIOS was not only shipped on early cards, but a variant of it with similar issues was made available with higher power targets later. There have been 6 total VBIOSes available to us since launch, 3 for each switch again, and the early public updates had this bug, so make sure you update to the newest VBIOS. Speaking of, those results were much better. When we checked the new VBIOS results, the card sustained just over 1700 megahertz for both the updated public options. As for the original OC VBIOS, that still ran over 100 degrees and didn't have the fan spin until 100 degrees Celsius junction. They just both did so, and it was a bit faster. So it managed to sustain the frequencies better than Silent did. As for how these numbers compare to the Sapphire Pulse 5600 XT, we've got another plot for that. We'll start with a line plot and then move to a bar graph. In this line plot, the newer Sapphire Pulse VBIOSes have the card's OC profile running about 1730 to 1745 megahertz. The Red Dragon's OC profile for public put it closer to 1700 to 1708 megahertz, allowing the Pulse a frequency advantage. As far as translating this to games, you're talking typically under a couple percentage points change in frame time reduction or frame rate increase, so it's not really something to get that worried about. You should be looking more at quality of life features, and also trivial overclock, even with AMD's mostly garbage software for overclocking, will get you past this difference anyway. The Pulse original OCV BIOS, for reference, ran about 1600 to 1610 megahertz versus the Red Dragon's 1575 to 1585 megahertz. The dip in the middle for the Pulse is an AMD API reporting error and a bug, and you should ignore it. That's not actually happening. Overall, the Pulse had much better VBIOS options at launch, and we'd feel okay with someone getting a card with an old VBIOS for the Pulse, even though you'd be ripped off, just because it'd at least still work properly. To simplify things, here's an average of the frequencies with the last few hundred cells selected in the range and averaged together. We don't really like bar graphs for frequency. It's a bit weird, and the scale doesn't necessarily translate the same way to FPS, but for purposes of this VBIOS comparison, it helps. The original PowerColor Red Dragon Silent VBIOS averaged about 1200 megahertz after dropping frequency from thermals, but the most recent public release does okay for both the Red Dragon VBIOS switches on the card. The new Silent VBIOS holds about 1695 megahertz, which puts it about 15 megahertz behind the Red Dragon OC VBIOS and 31 megahertz behind the Sapphire Pulse VBIOS. Sapphire is running the highest overall frequency here, but also has a higher power target at 160 watts. It'll come down to thermals for the main comparison. Time to move into those thermal numbers. As always, 40 dBA noise normalized testing allows us to isolate down to efficiency of the cooler and the VRM, whereas auto testing is more of a test of VBIOS, temperature targets, and fan speeds. The 40 dBA test will not show the Red Dragon's original faults of poor auto configuration, as we override that with manual fan control for like testing at the same noise levels. Keep in mind that the power target budget for each VBIOS will affect thermals, and we don't control for that since it's not exactly painless to change for a real user. If a card has a higher power target, it will run hotter. And so a higher power target card outperforming a lower power target card at the same noise level at a 20-inch distance is a significant feat. Speaking of that, the Sapphire Pulse at 135 watts outdoes the relevant 125 watt reviewer Red Dragon VBIOS by about 3 degrees Celsius for junction and about 1 degree for edge, which is within test variants. The newer OCV BIOSes have the Pulse at 160 watts and 72 degrees junction, with the Red Dragon at 150 watts and 73 degrees junction. Given that there's an extra 10 watts going through the Pulse, it pulls ahead as superior here, despite functional equivalence otherwise. It's the extra power budget that puts it in an advantageous position for this one. Sapphire's Pulse is the better design between the two cards, only furthered by pricing equivalence at the time of writing. For noise-normalized memory and VRM thermals, the Sapphire Silent VBIOS runs about 8 degrees cooler for GDDR6, with the new OC VBIOS for Sapphire at 66 degrees GDDR6 or 74 degrees for PowerColor. Both are completely within reason and well within spec, but Sapphire remains the leader with a better cooler. VRM MOS thermals are close enough and so far below mattering that they're irrelevant. Here's where it really gets interesting, although it normally doesn't for this chart. We're switching back to auto control and allowing VBIOS to dictate the fan performance. In the case of PowerColor, the original VBIOS, including the first publicly available quote upgrade on the website, only got one fan spinning at 1000 RPM and burned the card at about TJ max of 110C. Note that this was at 1200 megahertz, so it'd be worse if throttling didn't exist because the card wouldn't exist anymore. If PowerColor has some early units come back with scorch marks, this might be why. The edge to junction delta was a massive 36 degrees, one of the worst we've ever seen. The most recent public update has this much more reasonable, down to 83 degrees for the junction temperature for 150 watt performance VBIOS and 75 degrees for the 134 watt silent VBIOS. Both cards opt to spin between 30 dBA and 34 dBA stock and could be more aggressive with their fan speeds if the companies desired. The Pulse ends up winning overall. The new VBIOS for PowerColor's Red Dragon has the fan start spinning at 60 degrees now, within a 3 degree delta against the Sapphire Silent VBIOS, and functionally there's no difference with the OC VBIOS despite Sapphire running 10 watts higher. For GDDR6 and VRM MOS thermals under auto conditions, all the configurations are mostly fine, with the exception of the lowermost two results. The 85 degree GDDR6 temperature is overall kind of okay, although in a hotter ambient temperature than our 21 degree test environment, in most cases will be in the 30s, you'll be running closer to the 90s in that scenario. It's still fine, it's below spec, but it's worth noting as objectively inferior to some of the other numbers on these charts. This also comes after the Red Dragon memory speed bump, mind you, where they moved from 1500 megahertz to 1750 megahertz for the OC VBIOS update. So that obviously takes a toll on the thermals. Okay, so here's where we're going to talk about the differences between the cards. Took some footage of just getting all the screws out to show that, but they are not too different than the previous Pulse and Red Dragon models. One major difference being that the Sapphire Pulse low-end models like the 5500 are smaller, a lot smaller than these are, but this is a 5600 XT. So I've tracked the screws over here for each card. The lower, this is the GN mod mat. It's the medium mod mat specifically on store.gamersnexus.net. If you want to pick it up, these are actually in stock and shipping. But these are GPU themed. So anyway, we tracked both sets of screws. Clearly the PowerColor one, which is on the bottom here, has a lot fewer screws. That doesn't really necessarily mean anything. I'll talk more about that in a second. The Sapphire one is going with these longer screws that run all the way through the back plate, through the PCB, and then often into a plastic, the plastic shroud on the front side, or into the cooler, depending on which screw it is. So Sapphire's got a bit more hardware to take it apart, but also that in this instance helps with contact everywhere. There's obviously a point of diminishing returns, like the NVIDIA Founders Edition cards, where there's just so much going on in terms of screws and mounting hardware that it ends up being a negative. But in the instance of this cooler, it's fine. It's kind of right in the middle of what's normal. We should be able to just pull it off at this point. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we can start comparing the two cards and see why they performed the way they did in the review. So here's the two cards. The Sapphire card is using a larger sized cooler, but the PCB is actually not larger size, so they've just upscaled the cooler, which means the fans can run larger as a result, so they don't have to run the, they're closer to probably the 90 mil size. We can measure that. Yeah, that's about a 93 mil fan. So they're running the 93 mil fans despite the smaller PCB, which is fine. And then the PowerColor card is actually going with an upsized PCB to match its upsized cooler. So they are both physically taller than your standard short reference design. It's just that Sapphire's is largely additional plastic and cooling, whereas PowerColor's does have the PCB height as well. Doesn't really do a whole lot with that height. There's a ton of unused board space on here, but that's fine. Nothing really bad about that. For the cooler differences, the PowerColor card is running with also roughly 93 mil fans. Just double check and see. Sometimes they market these as 100, but 93 is not equal to 100, so we're going to call them 93. So they've got two here. These are three-point contact for the screws, and then a cable, and let's see if it terminates in a pad or if it needs to be if it's wired in. So that one is just a cable. What I'm looking for here is a lot of the better, more serviceable fans will use a pin to pad contact, where it's literally just pins and pads instead of dealing with this cable hanging off of it like this one is. And then all you have to do is socket the new one in to replace it. So this is a more standard fan design. It's a cheaper way to do it. And it's a little bit harder to service because then you'd have to reroute the whole cable inside of the shroud as well if you wanted to just replace the fan. Let's take a look at Sapphires for some contrast. So theirs is one screw up here, and it looks like that might release the whole fan. One. Cool. Much better. So just strictly from a maintenance standpoint, this doesn't really impact your performance at all. But strictly from a maintenance standpoint, this is something Sapphire's done well with lately, where they've switched pretty much entirely to just going with pins on the fan, and then it's not really pads at this point, it's just a connector, but a connector on the shroud. So all you have to do is socket it in place, and then that's your fan replacement, which is great because the most common failure for a video card, if it's not dead on arrival, is going to be the fan over time. This is a completely user serviceable part, whereas the PowerColor one, they probably wouldn't really want a user servicing that because you'd have to take apart the entire cooler. You'd have to get the cooler and the shroud off of there so that you could reroute the cable internally. But with the Sapphire configuration, it's one screw externally. You could leave the entire card assembled, and then you pop it out. So they've done better with maintainability of the cards, which is something we care about these days because there's no reason to get stuck in RMA hell waiting for your card to come back because the fan died when it's this easy to replace it. So Sapphire's done better here. They already were doing better in performance, but doing better in being able to service the card is a big upside. In terms of cooler quality, the Sapphire Cooler is a very simple aluminum fin stack. The fins run left to right rather than vertically. So you'll get some exhaust out of the back of the case, but the rest of it will go out towards the front, and then hopefully you have some fans inside the case to deal with the heat. All pretty basic stuff. It's a copper cold plate for the GPU, and that is either TIG welded or soldered into two heat pipes on this side, and then it looks like we've got a total of 3 heat pipes. So third one comes out over here, runs to the far side of the cooler. You've got one going straight through where the inductors and the MOSFETs line up, and then one going over to this side where the memory is. Your memory plate's right here. That looks like it's going to be an aluminum, but let's just double check. That's aluminum. So aluminum for the memory, which is completely fine. And also it was cooling well anyway, so we've seen the evidence that it works fine in this instance. The VRM, you've got MOSFET contact to its own plate, and then that into the aluminum fin stack, all pretty simple stuff. So that's the Sapphire Cooler, which came out of the shroud. That's Sapphire card. They've got their memory oriented the same way as PowerColor's, where it's just left-right flanking the GPU, not on the top slots. It's, I think, a reference PCB from AMD for this one, although I'm not 100% positive for these 5600 XTs. And they've got the fuses in place. There's a Sapphire thin as well, so these little fuses here marked with the Q. There's one over here. Those aren't shunt resistors. Those are just fuses that blow if something goes wrong. So from what I understand, from what BuildZoid has taught me, these little Q-marked sort of off-red fuses are more for helping Sapphire diagnose and potentially fix, but most likely just diagnose an issue rather than protecting the part. So it doesn't work like fuses and other electronics might, like high-sensitivity electronics. These do not react fast enough to protect the component behind it from blowing up, but they will trigger when it blows up so that you can find it, which helps a lot with diagnostics. That's more for Sapphire than for your sake, though. PowerColor doesn't have those, but it's not really a value add to you, the consumer, anyway. The backside, they've got a thermal pad running for the rear of the MOSFETs. So there's your MOSFET line. So that's good use of a backplate, and it looks like PowerColor's does that as well. We'll look in a second. You can see here there's the contact grease from the thermal pad, and it's not connecting with this plastic, which is to prevent shorts. It's just connecting straight into the aluminum, so you'd be surprised how rare that is, but that's good to see as well. These back plates, and it's a big piece of aluminum, so it's a natural heat sink, and it's good to see it used. And then the controller sinks into it as well. As for PowerColors, let's go ahead and take the rest of this apart and see how they do theirs. So many screws. PowerColor went a little insane on the screws for the back plate. This is completely unnecessary. This pile of screws right here, all of these with the black like damper on it, or well, it's really just to protect the PCB. But all those screws are just holding the back plate into the PCB. They used fewer holding the cooler to the PCB. So totally unnecessary. But anyway, there's one thermal pad here for the rear side of that would line up with almost exactly the MOSFETs. And there's the controller back there. Controller's back there too. They're not syncing theirs into it. Shouldn't particularly matter. All these parts run really cool anyway. So Vrm Thermal is mostly irrelevant between these two cards. But overall, the advantage, as you saw in thermal testing, does go to Sapphire's design for thermals, especially with the higher power budget. And they also have the advantage of easier maintenance. So although there were more screws I talked about at the beginning for getting the cooler apart initially, there are fewer overall because of the backplate difference. And that'll mostly wrap these two. Sapphire's been using these thermal pads for a little while now. In case you're ever in here, those look to be about maybe 1 mil thickness. They might be 0.5. It's gonna be like a 0.7. So I'm probably within error of 1.0 since 0.7 is a non-standard size. It does exist. That's 0.9. Yeah, so these are 1 mil thick, these memory thermal pads. And then PowerColor was running with, on their cooler, a bit thicker thermal pads, which might explain some of the performance delta because you want as thin of an interface as possible. But actually, let's look at their cooler a bit. So first of all, for the thermal pads, these are 1.5 actually, which is going to be less efficient. You want those to be minimized because the point is to get it into from silicon into metal as fast as possible. But most of that heat's going into the PCB anyway. There's a copper plate in the middle. It does look very nice. It's all nice and polished, but less effective overall. Copper plate in the middle. It looks like there's maybe, trying to find where the disadvantages would be for PowerColor versus Sapphire, because the cooler looks to be more complex, but ultimately, if you look at it, other than having more heat pipes, which would lead you to believe it's better, Sapphire is running with a much greater surface area. They have a thicker heatsink overall, and the PowerColor one's extremely thin. I mean, it's barely any, even if we got rid of that shroud you just see especially, but it's maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick on this layer, and then you've got some more here, but significantly less surface area for that one despite the increased height. And also, in terms of airflow, one of the benefits of this particular Sapphire design is that a lot of the air gets straight through the fin stack and onto the PCB, where it can assist in cooling some of the components on the PCB. And then you've got some more obstructions with the PowerColor design. But heat pipe wise, it does have more pipes and it's a bit more complicated. So you've got a heat pipe here routed. It looks like going, is that just bent? No, okay. It looks like that one's going to terminate over here potentially. But we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heat pipes. And it looks like a blank where there maybe used to be another one for maybe memory cooling. There's 2 separate fin stacks rather than one continuous fin stack. And it's got a blank spot in the middle where that's not helpful really for airflow in any way because there's no fan directly above that. So kind of wasted space, except they end up using it for all these heat pipes that end up not being as effective as the Sapphire solution anyway. So it looks like the slightly extra thickness on Sapphires is what's going to pull it ahead. And then obviously the original VBIOS is much better on Sapphires as well. But that's going to be it for the teardown. That shows the differences of the two cards. Now we can get back to talking about the conclusions. So that's the PowerColor RX 5600 XT Red Dragon. The very short version of all of this is that the card with the newest set of VBIOSes is acceptable, but it's not what we would call good. The Sapphire Pulse is better overall. It has a higher average frequency. It has a higher power budget default now for VBIOS, and it manages to run cooler while doing both of those things in a like-for-like scenario. So, plus it's got plenty of room, as does this card do, to increase the fan speed if you want to do a manual fan curve. That would suit you well, because both of their VBIOSes are pretty easy-handed on how aggressively they push the fans, which is to say not aggressively at all. So, if it's between the two, if you have two options and they're both in stock and they're both $290, which they are at the time of writing this script and filming the video, then our very firm recommendation is that you pass on the Red Dragon and you go for the Sapphire Pulse. The only reason we would go against that recommendation is if you have an extremely strong affinity for this look rather than Sapphire's more gamer-y red and black look that they go for, although this is kind of red and black too. But if you prefer this look, they're close enough. The performance delta is honestly mostly insignificant, but we're reviewers, and when you ask us to choose one part or the other, we try to give you a firm answer, and objectively, Sapphire's Pulse is the better card of the two. It's just that there's also not a massive difference after you update it. Before, a pretty massive difference, so make sure you do update it if you buy one. So that's the takeaway. Basically, the Pulse is the better card objectively and has technical victories in just about every category, and the Red Dragon is acceptable, and it's not that far behind, but it has technical losses in every category. So that's going to be it for this one. Thanks for watching. Pretty simple video. Subscribe for more. Check back for additional coverage of the 2060 KO. Actually, we've got some more stuff coming up on that, even though we broke the big story on it about the secret 2080 die in there. We've got some more thermal testing coming up on that one too, because they have the double stacked used chewing gum for thermal pet. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help directly by buying shirts like the one I'm wearing, but not literally this one. That would be gross and weird. Don't do that. Or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for extra behind-the-scenes videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.